I'm Lois Donnelly, interviewing Dr. Helen Malson on the 27th of June 2022 over Zoom. And we're discussing their life and career in the context of feminism and its history within psychology. So first of all then, I suppose, do you want to tell me a bit about yourself? So in terms of kind of the trajectory of your career and the topics of your work?
Yeah, sure. Yep. So my first degree wasn't in psychology. I studied human sciences at Sussex University in the 1980s. It was a really interesting kind of interdisciplinary degree. So it included biological sciences, but also philosophies of science, European literature, anthropology, Marxism, and a bit of psychology, but essentially even by the fourth year, you could, if you couldn't find the course in the entire university that suited you, you could persuade a tutor, a lecturer to take that module. You could design your own module, which I did with a friend of mine who was also doing that course, Tonya. And we persuaded a lecturer in clinical psychology to do a course with us on feminist perspectives on psychoanalysis. So looking at feminist psychoanalytic theory, which was just really, really interesting. And that kind of, I'd got really interested in gender, psychoanalytic theory, sort of throughout those 4 years of the degree, and that kind of consolidated things for me. But I guess I'd kind of thought about my PhD area. I was really sure from about the age of 10 that I wanted to be an academic. My dad was a technician at Southampton University, and he was always talking about what a cushy life lecturers had. So I thought, right, that's the job for me.
Oh, gosh.
Sadly, things changed enormously between then and actually starting a lectureship. But so I never got the cushy number I was after. but I knew I wanted to do a PhD, and I knew I was interested in psychoanalytic theory and the way in which it talked about the significance of bodies and their kind of translation in a non-deterministic, non-biological way into kind of gendered subjectivity. And it was during a seminar about Sylvia Plath, and I don't know quite how all the thoughts came together, but it occurred to me that women's distress, which had been kind of primarily theorized in a lot of psychoanalytic work in terms of hysteria, might be understood today in terms of anorexia, or by today, I mean the 1980s.
Yeah.
So I had those kind of thoughts around what I wanted to look at, that kind of, gender and kind of bodies and something around distress, and focused on eating disorders and around psychoanalytic theory. And that's really where my kind of PhD ideas started. And since then, although I've had a kind of sometimes done some broader research into kind of gender subjectivity and media representations around gender, kind of the majority of my work is around eating disorders.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. So so you kind of started off then maybe not fully knowing that you'd go into that kind of psychology arena. So what kind of attracted you then to your degree first of all, and then to kind of head into psychology?
Oh, well, really, it was a misconception of what psychology was. Because I'd come across Freud and psychoanalytic theory more generally in anthropology and in literary theory. and then cultural studies generally, and it just did not occur to me that it wouldn't be an enormous part of psychology. And so, yeah, I was kind of quite surprised, really, at a lot of what mainstream psychology was about. Totally taken aback. What stopped me from then moving out, and I did think about moving into cultural studies, but was the work of people like Henri Kettel and Potter and Weatherall's kind of early discourse analytic book. That kind of, and those were really, I suppose, the inspiration for then what my PhD kind of went along with, kind of that and getting really into Foucault through Henri Kettel. So I did a genealogy of medical discourses in which anorexia first emerged as a kind of medical object, and then interview studies with women who identified as eating disordered, and did a discourse analysis of those.
So was that your PhD?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah. So kind of shocked about mainstream psychology in a bad way, then, in terms of
just kind of really, yes, I guess so. Yeah. I was this idea that it was a science, having come from kind of a mixture of sort of philosophy, English lit, European literature and thought, those sorts of modules, but also being in a biology lab and using doing mass spectrometry and extracting DNA from fly bodies and doing genetics and stuff. I was like, you seriously call this a science? It's just a questionnaire.
Yeah.
So yeah, in many ways I was just very surprised about what was going on, but just kind of went, okay, well, I'm using Henri Kettel and discourse analysis and I'm just going to get on with it.
Yeah, so the more kind of societal and kind of cultural things within psychology, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And so how did feminism come into that then? When did your kind of identity as a feminist maybe develop?
Ooh, probably around about being 10, I guess.
Okay.
My parents are kind of quite religious from a Catholic background, and I went to Catholic schools. Well, since we moved, and I went to Catholic schools from I was about age 10, but they also had The Guardian delivered every day, so I was kind of familiar with that sort of 70s, 80s feminist writing, to the extent that it appeared in The Guardian. And I was kind of increasingly kind of frustrated at things like not being allowed to do woodwork, and so forth. So I guess, you know, I came into my undergraduate degree with a kind of feminist perspective. I'm not sure how much I would have labeled it as feminist, but certainly a kind of distinct and personal awareness of the restrictions that went along with being a girl and then a young woman, and how those were sometimes quite different in different contexts. Yeah, and then then doing a module on structural anthropology. There was a really, I can't remember her name now, but a really interesting feminist anthropologist took our seminars, and I remember getting really interested in the way in which structural anthropology is written from a very masculine perspective when they're talking about reciprocity in structures of kinship. There was nothing about how that's different if you're the object of that reciprocal kind of gift giving, if you like, in terms of women being swapped between kinship groups. And this tutor kind of was really kind of enthusiastic and engaged with my questions about that, which, yeah, just, I suppose, kind of gave me that confidence to go, you can be a feminist academic. That would be something interesting to pursue.
Yeah, that's kind of quite early on then in your kind of path, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. And so, yeah, something like, well, anorexia, because bulimia in the 80s wasn't really kind of, well, at least I didn't know about it as a category. And it was in some ways quite high profile. There were people like Lena Zavaroni, was a famous celebrity who had anorexia, and it was variously in kind of sensationalized newspaper reports and documentaries and those sorts of things. So I just thought it's just an really interesting, really contemporary expression of that kind of mirrors in so many ways hysteria as kind of both a kind of hyperconformity and a resistance to those gendered norms and restrictions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so and so that's quite a kind of, so your feminist values then were quite ingrained with kind of the topic and the direction that you were going in.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess I chose well in some ways because I'm still doing it.
Yeah, so I was going to kind of ask about that, because obviously, yeah, as you say, your work is a lot around eating disorders and kind of body image and stuff. So can you maybe tell me like how those projects have developed over the years, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I suppose probably the main way that they've developed is becoming a bit more applied in terms of sort of after the PhD, the next projects that I were doing were around the experiences of treatment for eating disorders. So I did some work in at the Maudsley with Janet Treasure, interviewing people there about their experiences of treatment. And then in Sydney, when I moved over to the University of Western Sydney in the late 90s, I worked with Simon Clark, who ran the adolescent ward in Westmead Hospital, which is just in kind of inland Sydney, but served kind of an enormous area. So there were people from kind of quite suburban and inner city districts, but there were also kind of rural people coming in too. And from there, I guess it's got even more applied in that now I'm a director of an eating disorders health integration team, which is like it's a team of people, the academics, clinicians, people with lived experience, people from the voluntary sector and so forth, across lots of different organizations. And we're funded by an organisation called Bristol Health Partners, which is again a kind of multi-organisational sort of structure of NHS trusts and universities. And that's just got me, again, I'm still researching kind of treatment issues and those sorts of things. So the project that I have been working on, or one of the projects I've been working on, is around experiences of seeking help and through primary care for an eating disorder. But I'm also involved in, I guess, less researchy, more product-based kinds of things and service developments, kind of so the the team supports kind of local service developments. We've been involved in developing an eating disorders support app with a local GP who specialises in producing mental health apps, those sorts of things. And with Paula Salco, I've been working recently. We did some interviews with people about their social media use, and then we did a video. We worked with People at Beat, which is the big national eating disorders charity, to produce a kind of short video on sort of safer social media use.
Okay.
So yeah, at the moment, I'm kind of combining sort of research projects with more kind of hands-on, I guess, applied work. And the other things that we do are like public engagement events, sort of art-based events, and I'm involved in kind of there's a steering group that's been developing plans to reorganize services, eating disorder services locally, that I've also been involved in. And that's just really interesting. So it's not so clearly labeled as feminist, but equality issues are still kind of obviously, well, not necessarily obviously, but they are a big part of that agenda too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I suppose, how do you think maybe your feminist values kind of impact the way that you do that work?
I think both the other co-director, Sani, who's a clinical psychologist, both of us are very keen to make sure that the perspectives of people with eating disorders are kind of informing and shaping what we do. And we've got a peer co-director who has experience of an eating disorder, and we have kind of public engagement events where we ask people to kind of like comment on what they think we should be doing, what priorities there are for them in terms of research or service development, and those sorts of things. So it's, I guess, about reshaping the place of people with lived experience in research and services, because I think in eating disorders research, a lot of and treatment, a lot of the time people with eating disorders have been kind of, their views have been often dismissed as it's the eating disorder talking. So unless you're just fully compliant with what you're told you ought to be doing, then there isn't a lot of space, or there hasn't historically been a lot of space. I mean, that said, I've noticed at eating disorders conferences, there is also beginning to be a wider real shift in problematizing that kind of marginalization of eating disorder voices. And BEAT, for instance, have eating disorders ambassadors who are people with lived experience. So it's a kind of, it's happening more broadly as well. I guess the other ways in which being a feminist kind of impacts on what we do is obviously promoting qualitative research and kind of, so getting those people's voices through qualitative research, and a less pathologizing perspective for our research, of course, too. And being very aware of the kind of equality and diversity aspect of service provision. So part of the work that I'm doing at the moment, which has been looking at, as I said, people's experiences of seeking help. And it's involved interviews with carers as well as people with lived experience and with GPs. And there's clearly quite a stereotype, or set of stereotypes really, obviously about young women, but also about who has an eating disorder and what does an eating disorder look like. And although young women, white young women who are thin, have trouble accessing services and being taken seriously, it's kind of being very aware that that it's potentially even a worse situation for those people that don't fit that stereotype. That kind of, you know, locally we don't even have at the moment binge eating disorder services, and that's something that's changing now. That with the steering group is putting those services into place, but given how common binge eating disorder is, and those kinds of experiences that you might call in that direction, it's telling, obviously, that the services haven't existed till now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm glad to hear that it's kind of shifting a little bit, and yeah, that's great. And so I suppose in terms of, you know, yeah, talking about collaborating and working with service providers and the NHS and stuff, what is that like to kind of work beyond academia?
I really like it. There are less egos. Yeah, the health integration team is it's just a really nice, collaborative, sort of supportive environment. And I guess partly that's also because you're kind of choosing to work with these people, and they're choosing to work with you, and you don't kind of contractually have to. It's also got its own obstacles and barriers and frustrations, obviously, especially at the moment, because there's been a massive increase in eating disorders during the pandemic. So things are kind of, in terms of colleagues' workloads, it's even worse now, but there is that kind of, you know, they have kind of their clients and service users as a kind of as a priority. So sometimes it's hard to get hold of people, or hard to get things moving or continuing to move, and so forth. And of course the NHS has its own hideous admin that's no better than university admin to deal with,
I'm sure. Yeah. And so do you see, I'm just interested to know, kind of, do you see your research actively kind of impacting on the way that service is provided and things?
Yes, I think so. Certainly, that's the work that I did with experiences of inpatient treatment in Sydney, then became part of a nurse training events whilst I was there. The work that I've done looking at experiences of primary care is now kind of feeding into the eating disorders training work stream of the steering group, so that it's kind of written in to the plans to improve training. And so I've been involved in drafting the training strategy document for non-specialist staff and individuals and so forth. So yeah, that I think is kind of also a really satisfying part of working in this kind of more applied multi-institution setting, is that kind of things do happen kind of more directly sometimes, not always, but
yeah, I can imagine that that's really nice to see things changing.
Yeah. And with the app, you know, you're involved in discussions, so that wasn't a research project, but you're involved in those discussions and helping to organize events where people with lived experience come and talk about what they think should be on the app and so forth. And then it's there, and you know, it's got 6,000 downloads and good reviews and those sorts of things. And yeah, that feels like, you know, it's not, I mean, obviously I enjoy having a journal article published, but you never know if anyone's going to read it, do you?
Yeah.
Whereas do know with this, that it's a thing.
Yeah, it's more public facing, I suppose.
Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Okay. So do you have any kind of particular piece of work or accomplishment that you're most proud of then?
I suppose definitely the work that I've done with Sani and the other team members in the eating disorders HIT. I guess I'd say my books, and then a recent thing that I've been really proud of is some work that I did with Andrea Lamar, Michael Levine and Sue Holmes. And we co-authored two papers together that were part of kind of an entire discussion, which was around feminist approaches to eating disorders research and treatments. And that again was a really nice collaborative experience. I think there's something kind of really heartwarming when you kind of like feel like you're all working together and being supportive and supported. But yeah, so we got that published in the Journal of Eating Disorders, which also feels like a massive achievement, because the big eating disorder journals, the mainstream ones, tend not to be so enamored of qualitative research or feminist arguments and so forth.
Oh, how does that? Yeah, how do you find that? How do you kind of work with that in day to day?
What it means is that I just end up generally publishing in more feminist, community oriented journals, and I think that feminist eating disorder research generally is kind of a bit scattergunned because of that.
Right.
That there's feminist work on eating disorders kind of covers, I mean, obviously there's some in psychology, but in media studies, cultural studies, anthropology, social work, nursing. So it's kind of across lots of disciplines already. And then because people like the International Journal of Eating Disorders are kind of a bit sniffy about it, you can find it anywhere, or it's hard to find as well sometimes.
And so do you have an idea why they prefer kind of those more maybe quantitative and kind of papers?
Yeah, the usual reason. It's gatekeepers who take a more positivist or arguably post-positivist approach, where RCT trials are best, where still I think a kind of more pathologizing conceptualization of eating disorders predominates.
That makes sense. So could you tell me a little bit about your involvement with the Psychology of Women Inequalities section of the BPS then?
Yeah, it's something I got involved with as a postgrad to start with. And I stayed involved for several years. So I was on the committee and things until 1999, when I left I moved to Sydney and got obviously less involved. And then I've kind of been involved on and off, but in a less intense way until recently.
Yeah, and obviously you're now currently the chair.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's great. And how have you felt like that plays kind of a part in your work, being involved with POWES?
I suppose it's the informal or less formal networking aspect of POWES, feeling that you're part of a community. So those instances where, as a feminist qualitative psychologist, you might feel slightly isolated in your views, that knowing that there is a whole section there of people of like-minded people is nice. And yeah, knowing and working with different people, often through POWES. So for instance, I knew Victoria before us. I started at UE.
Victoria Clark.
Yes, yes. And I guess earlier in my career, kind of people like Anne Woolett and Paula Nicholson were kind of important kind of mentors, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah, that's really great. And how were you first introduced to POWES?
That would have been through my supervisor, Jane Usher. She was an early POWES member, so she took me along to POWES conferences.
So you started fairly early then attending those?
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So are there any other kind of feminist organizations that you're a part of that, you know, maybe similar to POWES?
Don't think so. I mean, I guess you could call, you know, part of Victoria and Ginny's story completion group. So I guess I mean, it's implicitly feminist.
Yeah.
But
yeah, no, that's great. That's really interesting. So yeah, that focuses more on kind of methodology and that kind of particular story completion. That's interesting. Okay, so yeah, what do you think then?
Sorry, I was just remembering that.
Yes.
So actually, myself and Julie Kent, she's retired now, but was a professor in sociology at UE. And we started a gender studies research group at UE, which went really nicely for a few years, but just didn't have institutional support. So eventually just kind of fizzled out, really.
That's interesting. Yeah, is it difficult to kind of start groups like that without that kind of institutional backing?
I would say so, because people have to give their time without it being factored into workloads. There's no institutional recognition of what you're doing as well. So it's kind of an uphill struggle, I would say, to do things when you don't have that kind of support.
And do you think it's more difficult if they're kind of feminist-based groups to get institutional support?
I would say so, and I think also part of the struggle that our gender studies research group had was that it was deliberately kind of transdisciplinary, which made it go across faculties, and at the time working across faculties was, you know, de facto a problem.
Interesting.
Because of budgets and so forth.
Okay, great. And so I suppose since you've been at POWES, kind of, yeah, it's been part of your kind of career since fairly early days then. How do you think POWES has kind of developed over the years, do you think?
I suppose probably the most obvious thing is that it's now got an E in the title. And, you know, along with that is a much wider appreciation of the importance of taking an intersectional approach. I think I remember being on some sort of panel discussion in the 90s about, although it wasn't called intersectionality, it was around those issues. To what extent should we be should POWES be interested in disability rights or racism or whatever, or would that detract from our focus on gender inequality? So I think those debates were still happening when in the first few years of kind of being involved in POWES, whereas I think they're kind of, at least the majority of people, I would say, kind of like see them as common sense now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's kind of shifted maybe.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that's changed is people's workloads are massively heavier than they used to be. Yeah. I would say. And it's a much more, academia is a much more kind of gig economy in some ways, but for some people at least.
Yeah. Do you think that impacts the way that POWES works?
I don't know. I think that's a tricky question, but I think it makes it harder for people to do things that aren't part of their kind of contracted job.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think then that that POWES will or should develop differently in the future?
I think it's a really tricky question. I think theoretically, methodologically, etc., no. But in terms of kind of the jobs that are required, if you like, to keep a section going, it would be nice to see some more sort of, I guess, financial support or some other kind of support. I don't know about you, but I don't have my role in POWES kind of factored into my workload at all. So maybe seeing if the BPS can be involved in kind of pressurizing departments into recognizing those sorts of roles. Maybe there's some other sort of support that could ease the way in which people can get involved and take part in POWES. And of course, there's equality issues in that as well, aren't there? To who is able to take some time extra on top of everything else.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that maybe POWES could be, and other sections could be doing more, is thinking more about how we include more people from different diverse backgrounds and so forth in the section generally, in the committee. Where should we advertise, for instance? Should we be thinking about advertising outside of kind of usual BPS contexts? And I guess the other thing that has been brought to my attention recently is things like conference accessibility. Obviously, in some ways it was great, in some ways dreadful, having an only online conference. But going back to Cumberland Lodge now, for instance, you know, is that accessible enough?
Yeah.
Does the fact that it's in Windsor Great Park alienate people in some way, or some people in some way? I mean, I don't know what the answers are to those questions, but just as kind of things that could be potentially thought about more.
Yeah, no, those good points. Great. And so how have you kind of found being chair then this year?
It's been great, really. It's been really nice to be more involved. I wish I had more time to devote to it.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm in no way near alone. It's probably a kind of virtually universal experience to feel like you're kind of trying to cram millions of things into a day. But no, it's been really nice, and it's been quite nice to see the BPS for all its faults, at least moving towards a kind of more towards a kind of perspective that takes equality and social issues more seriously, however slowly and belatedly that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, kind of how do you feel about the name change, obviously, to add the equalities into the section?
I think it's a good thing. I think because, you know, I mean, amongst other things, the work that POWES members do isn't only about women, and so I think it kind of points to that importance of moving beyond the interview studies with women, which are obviously incredibly important and valuable, but that there's it's not just about gender inequalities, it's about a whole raft of inequalities, and it's about a whole raft of people's experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of reflects that better.
I think so. To me, it does anyway.
Yeah. And so you're also kind of a consulting editor for Feminism Psychology Journal.
I used to be. I think I no longer am.
Okay. And then you're also, are you an editor for Power, which is the journal for POWES?
I'm on the editorial board.
So how are those kind of roles, how does that what are those roles like, and how does that impact your work as well?
I suppose, you know, I mean, obviously I do manuscript reviewing, and sometimes that, you know, that makes me kind of familiar with a particular person and their work that I wouldn't otherwise have necessarily come across. And sometimes, obviously, I'm reading something that might be a little bit out of my usual field of reading. Not that I get that much time for reading, but that, you know, that does inform my work in a sort of in interesting ways, or they've approached it in this way, or that I wouldn't have thought of doing, and those sorts of things, and becoming familiar with arguments that I hadn't been necessarily familiar with. So I guess it expands my general kind of engagement with feminist work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, you were talking earlier about kind of POWES as a network, I suppose, and I was just wondering kind of the role that played in your career, and also kind of perhaps those mentoring roles and kind of key mentors that you might have had along the way.
Right. So I suppose I've said, haven't I, Anne Willett and Paula Nicholson, and Anne Phoenix as well was around, kind of like someone that I spent time with in the 1990s when I was at UEL. So the kind of POWES network and the UEL, feminist UEL network, and sometimes ex-UEL network, kind of was part of that kind of mentorship, I think, which was really useful and valuable to me in terms of feeling supported and just kind of generally getting advice, really, as a new lecturer at the time, kind of dealing with the big boys club and those kinds of things that I think are really, really useful, as well as obviously more practical advice. Well, not that it's not practical to know how to deal with a big boys club, but just managing things generally. And I learned particularly from Anne Woollett, who was also at UEL at the same time as me and chair of POWES whilst I was the secretary. Was just, yeah, a really valuable kind of influence on my early career.
That's great. Yeah, so really important in kind of, yeah, you're getting started and everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great.
And yeah, I guess before that actually as well, Jerry Webster, I guess, who was he ran the human science program, and that I kept in touch with. Well, all of us kept in touch with, almost all of us kept in touch with, you know, for years and years. I mean, he died, I think it was last year, but quite recently. But we were still, everyone was still in touch. It was quite a small course, and he was quite a kind of mentor in a more, maybe a more distant way. Sorry, I'll just shut that phone off. And then Barbara Lloyd, who supervised me during my PhD for a little while around feminist approaches to around feminist psychoanalytic theory. And yeah, that was really interesting, sitting in her office, which was an enormous office, just totally lined with books, really nice sunny office, and we just sit and talk about Juliet Mitchell and Jacqueline Rose and Janet Sayers, and it was just quite a relaxed but very, I felt very, I suppose, nurtured by it. But she wasn't officially one of my supervisors, but she just spent this time talking with me about feminist psychoanalytic theory. That's lovely. Yeah, that's great to kind of be able to have those chats about the things that you're learning and reading about. Yeah. Okay. So do you play a role as a mentor yourself now, do you think? Yeah, I guess I do. In terms of probably my undergraduate dissertation students, and in terms of my postgrad students, yeah, in particular. So yeah, and I think I do quite enjoy it. I think it's in some ways, particularly maybe with the undergraduates at the moment, it's become more important to add in a personal element to it, with the kind of like a lot of people experiencing quite a lot of stress around lockdown and so forth. And I don't know about you, but I find that still kind of is still there, that those sorts of heightened stress and anxiety levels. But I also really enjoy with those students that really kind of get into their research, whether it's at undergraduate or postgraduate level, kind of going forward with them and producing publications and kind of pushing them theoretically and methodologically, and seeing them being really pleased with what they've done. So so Jill, who I supervised 2 or 3 years ago now, who did their project on media representations of the Kavanaugh case, sort of working through with her to her publication, putting in the prize submission, getting it published, talking with them later when they're doing they did a master's in gender and international relations, and kind of just seeing someone flourish like that is really, I really enjoy. Irmgard Tishner, who's now she's a professor at Deggendorf, sort of working with, so I supervised her PhD, and then seeing her kind of working on publications with her, and seeing her career blossom similarly.
Yeah, that's a great feeling, isn't it, to go along with something like that. Okay, well, I think we're kind of nearing the end. So I was going to ask you more in terms of kind of feminism and psychology more broadly. What impact do you think feminists have made in psychology so far?
I think it's a pity it's not more, and that's not the fault of feminists. But I think we have had an impact, and I think in some ways it's hard to pull apart from some other kinds of things or approaches like qualitative research more generally, but there is a kind of wider recognition of qualitative approaches, of the significance of gender. I think it often gets treated a little bit, inequalities and gender issues, any other inequality issues too, often get treated as, we'll have a lecture here and a lecture there you go. But at least there are those lectures now. And in lots of places it's a more serious engagement as well. So I think it's a long way until we see a mainstream psychology textbook being feminist just because of course you are.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, they are at least engaged to some extent with those agendas, or at least recognizing them.
Yeah. And do you think that some institutions then are more on board with those kind of things than other institutions, and why do you think that might be?
I think it's probably the psychology, and my guess is it's more, I mean, I don't know, but my guess is it would be more local to the department of culture as well as the broader institution. I mean, my feeling is with kind of institutional levels, it's often quite tick boxy.
Yeah.
And so the way in which feminist approaches or inequality issues generally are kind of engaged with is the extent to which it goes beyond a tick box is, I think, quite often left up to the individuals and the culture within a department.
Yeah.
And I guess in terms of the other ways in which feminism might impact psychology, I guess we've still got a long way to go in terms of sexual harassment on campus and kind of pay inequalities. But I'm not sure what the section's role in that might be.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of how those come together. Yes. So I suppose those kind of things you think is maybe the future of feminist psychology, kind of thinking about those issues.
It would be an interesting thing to think about, how that's feasible. Yeah, I think it would be nice to think it could be something that POWES could contribute to in some way.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's the kind of work on like the intersectionality and violence, gender and violence research group, and those kinds of those work going on in terms of sexual harassment. But I guess I was thinking more in terms of kind of impacting directly into kind of university policies and so forth. Whether that, I've no idea how you'd go about doing that.
Yeah, would be good though.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Maybe see if the BPS could withhold something or other until things are corrected.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, and then what advice would you give then to feminists entering psychology now?
Ooh, think carefully. Are you sure? Yeah, what advice would I give people? I think that's a really difficult question. I think it's because it's such a different sort of landscape to when I joined academia. I think, yeah, get some allies, make sure you're networked if you can, and protect your time. I think, yeah, I still have trouble saying no to things. And obviously it's in some ways a sort of gendered issue. And a lot of the time I think it works against us that we kind of agree to this, that and the other, which isn't necessarily enhancing our careers in a kind of, promotion kind of way.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm reticent to say be more hard-nosed as well, because some of those things that we do are kind of, even if they're not recognized, are really important. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's complicated. You're right. Yeah, that's a good point. And so, yeah, I don't know, why do you think having the allies is important? So by allies, I assume you mean kind of other feminist psychologists.
Yeah, because you can be kind of sidelined. It depends where you are and what the people around you are like, but you can definitely be kind of sidelined.
Okay, yeah, from like the mainstream psychology.
Well, yeah, exactly, in that it's not mainstream psychology and it's not seen as this is where the bread and butter kind of things are, or the kind of center of things are. It's a kind of luxury add-on niche,
yes,
kind of approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, I think that's the end, all the questions I've got. Is there anything else that I haven't mentioned that you'd like to cover about yourself or about feminist psychology?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, brilliant.